Poor Black Maid replaced her mother. Mafia Boss was shocked by the truth. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to Naomi Carter. Naomi Carter stepped quietly through the side entrance of the Hale estate just before sunrise, the gravel crunching softly beneath her worn sneakers as the eastern sky shifted from black to a dull gray. At 24, she carried herself with a careful stillness, as if taking up too much space might draw attention she could not afford. The mansion loomed ahead, all white stone and tall windows, the kind of place that smelled faintly of polished wood and money even before you crossed the threshold. Naomi paused for a moment, adjusting the simple black cardigan she wore over her uniform, the fabric thin from too many washes, and took a slow breath. This was her first full day replacing her mother, though no one inside the house knew that yet. To them, she was just another temporary hire, a poor black maid brought in quietly to fill a vacancy that had never been properly explained. Inside, the house was still asleep, the long hallways echoing faintly with her footsteps as she followed the routine she had memorized long before she ever set foot here as an employee. She knew where the light switches were without looking, which stair creaked on the third step, which door needed a gentle push to latch properly. These were not things a new maid should know, but Naomi moved through the space with a familiarity that came from years of listening to her mother's stories at a small kitchen table miles away. Stories told late at night after double shifts, stories filled with exhaustion and quiet pride. Her mother, Evelyn Carter, had given more than 2 decades of her life to this house, to the man who owned it, Victor Hale, a powerful figure whose name was spoken carefully in certain circles. When Evelyn could no longer climb the stairs without stopping to catch her breath, when her hands began to tremble as she held a tray, she had resigned without ceremony, leaving behind a space that was quickly filled, at least on paper. What Victor Hale did not know was that Naomi had not come here chasing opportunity or ambition. She had come because her mother asked her to, because there were bills stacked neatly on a kitchen counter and a promise whispered one night when the pain was bad and the future uncertain. Naomi began her work as the house stirred awake, brewing coffee the way she had been taught, measuring grounds by instinct rather than scoop, setting out a porcelain mug in the exact spot it had always been placed. When Victor Hale entered the kitchen later that morning, tall, composed, his presence filling the room without a word, he barely glanced at her. He nodded once, absently, already lost in thought. Naomi lowered her gaze respectfully, her hands steady as she worked, her heart pounding with the weight of everything unsaid. In that quiet exchange, something invisible passed between them. A history he did not recognize and a truth she carried alone, a truth that would soon surface and change the way he saw not just the girl standing before him, but the woman she had come to replace. By the end of that first week, Naomi Carter had learned exactly how invisible she was expected to be. Victor Hale did not raise his voice, did not issue harsh commands, and did not acknowledge her beyond what was strictly necessary. His instructions came through short nods, brief looks, or a quiet word delivered without meeting her eyes. To him, Naomi was a function, not a presence, and she understood that role well. She moved through the house with measured steps, keeping her shoulders slightly rounded, her gaze lowered, her voice calm and respectful whenever she was addressed. Each morning, she rose before 5, riding the first bus across town while the city was still dark, her reflection faint in the window beside her. She arrived with time to spare, always early, always prepared, because lateness was a luxury she could not afford. What Victor Hale did not see was the discipline behind her calm, the careful control she had learned long before stepping into his world. Naomi had grown up watching her mother come home exhausted, shoes in hand, feet swollen after standing for 10 or 12 hours straight. Evelyn Carter never complained. She sat at the small kitchen table, counting tips, folding uniforms, rubbing ointment into her wrists while reminding Naomi to finish her homework and aim higher than cleaning other people's houses. And yet, when Evelyn's health began to fail, when the doctor said the word heart and spoke about limits and rest, It was Naomi who made the quiet decision to step into her place. In the Hale estate, Naomi worked with a precision that went unnoticed by most, but not entirely by Victor. He found his coffee was always the right temperature, hot, but not bitter, the way he preferred it, but had never bothered to explain. His jacket appeared laid out exactly when he needed it, the cuffs brushed clean, the buttons checked. The study smelled faintly of lemon oil again, the same scent it had carried years ago before something had changed. These details stirred a vague irritation in him, the unsettling sense that the house was remembering something he had forgotten. Naomi never lingered. She cleaned, organized, and stepped back into the background. Even when Victor's guests passed through the halls without a glance, their conversations low and confident, their laughter echoing off marble floors. Once, as she polished the banister on the second floor, Victor paused at the bottom of the stairs, watching her for a brief moment longer than usual. There was nothing remarkable about her appearance, he told himself. She was young, thin, plainly dressed, her hair pulled back neatly. And yet, the way she worked carried a familiarity that unsettled him. He dismissed the thought as nostalgia, an inconvenience he did not have time for. That evening, Naomi stayed late to finish a task no one had asked her to complete. In the staff kitchen, alone, she sat for a moment with her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea, the steam warming her face. She pulled her phone from her pocket and checked the time, calculating the walk home, the bus schedule, the cost of groceries she needed to buy. Before leaving, she sent a short message to her mother, telling her she was fine, telling her the job was going well. She did not mention the weight in her chest or the ache in her legs. Evelyn Carter replied with a heart and a reminder to rest when she could. Naomi slipped the phone away, squared her shoulders, and returned to work, unaware that the quiet patterns she followed were slowly drawing Victor Hale toward a truth he was not ready to face. The third week brought with it a subtle shift that Victor Hale could no longer ignore, though he did not yet have the words for it. It began with small disruptions to his carefully controlled routine, moments so minor they would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. One morning, as he reached for his usual medication, he found the glass of water already waiting on the nightstand, filled to the level he preferred, neither too full nor too low. He paused, frowning slightly, because he had never told anyone that detail. Later that same day, Naomi adjusted the thermostat in the study just before the afternoon sun hit the windows, lowering it by exactly 2 degrees, the same adjustment Evelyn Carter used to make years ago when the room grew stuffy. Victor noticed the change only because he felt more comfortable without understanding why. These coincidences unsettled him in a way he did not like. He prided himself on awareness, on control, and yet something in his own home seemed to be moving ahead of him, anticipating needs he had not voiced. From a distance, he began to watch Naomi more closely, though he told himself it was simply good management. She worked steadily, without rushing, without wasting motion, as if every task had already been planned before her hands touched anything. When she dusted his office, she avoided a specific corner near the bookshelf, one that held a framed photograph turned face down. That was not something a new maid would instinctively do. Naomi never asked questions, never sought attention, but the house responded to her presence as though it recognized her. One afternoon, a storm rolled in unexpectedly, dark clouds pressing low over the estate. Victor was in the study, absorbed in paperwork, when he heard the windows being closed one by one. Naomi moved through the rooms with quiet urgency, securing the house against the rain. When thunder cracked overhead, she paused briefly at the hallway window, counting seconds under her breath before the rain hit, then closed it just in time. Victor looked up, irritation giving way to curiosity. Evelyn had used to do that, counting the seconds, predicting the storm like a skill learned over decades. He pushed the thought away, annoyed with himself for clinging to the past. That evening, Victor hosted a small, informal dinner, nothing elaborate. Naomi prepared the table with careful precision, placing the silverware in an arrangement Victor had not seen since before Evelyn left. It was not standard. It was personal. When he sat down and noticed, something tightened in his chest. He did not comment. Instead, he studied Naomi as she moved silently around the room, refilling water glasses, clearing plates before anyone asked. Her expression remained calm, respectful, but there was a weight behind her eyes, a focus that suggested she was not merely working but fulfilling something. Later, as the guests left and the house settled into quiet again, Victor stood alone in the dining room, staring at the empty chairs. He felt an unfamiliar unease, as though the walls were closing in on a truth he had carefully avoided for years. Upstairs, Naomi finished her final tasks, her body aching as she climbed the steps, but her movements never slowed. In the privacy of the linen closet, she leaned briefly against the shelves, closing her eyes, pressing a hand to her chest as she caught her breath. She thought of her mother, of Evelyn's instructions, spoken softly from a hospital bed, reminders about where things belonged, about how Mr. Hale liked his routines respected. Naomi straightened, smoothing her uniform, and returned to work. Neither of them realized that the distance between memory and reality was narrowing, that the patterns Naomi followed were not just habits, but breadcrumbs leading Victor Hale toward a truth that had been waiting patiently for him to notice. The realization did not arrive all at once for Victor Hale, but its weight settled into him during a quiet afternoon when the house felt heavier than usual. He was alone in his study, the door closed, the distant sound of Naomi moving through the halls faint but steady, when he opened a drawer he had not touched in years. Inside were old documents, outdated schedules, and beneath them, a thin folder with Evelyn Carter's name written in his assistant's careful handwriting. He had not asked where she went when she left, had not pressed for details, because life had moved forward and he had allowed it to. Now, as he flipped through the papers, fragments of memory surfaced without permission. He remembered Evelyn's voice, calm and firm, reminding him to eat when he worked too long, reminding him that the human body had limits even when the mind refused to accept them. He remembered the way she would stand just inside the doorway in the evenings, not intruding, simply waiting to see if he needed anything before leaving for the night. At the time, he had taken it for granted. In another part of the city, Naomi remembered those same years differently. She remembered sitting on the floor as a child, coloring quietly while her mother ironed uniforms late into the night, the television murmuring in the background. She remembered Evelyn's hands, strong but worn, folding crisp white shirts with care, teaching Naomi how to smooth wrinkles with patience rather than force. Evelyn spoke often of the Hale estate, not with bitterness, but with responsibility, describing the routines, the expectations, the way a house like that demanded respect and consistency. When Evelyn's health began to decline, Naomi had watched her mother struggle to keep up, watched her hide shortness of breath and fatigue behind a practiced smile. The day Evelyn finally admitted she could not continue, she sat Naomi down at the kitchen table and spoke plainly. She said the job was not just work, it was trust. She said if Naomi ever stepped into that house, she must do so with dignity, not resentment. Those words echoed now as Naomi moved through the Hale estate, carrying more than mops and trays, carrying a legacy she had never spoken aloud. Back in the study, Victor closed the folder slowly. His gaze drifted to the bookshelf where the framed photograph remained turned face down. Without thinking, he reached out and turned it upright. It was an old picture, one he rarely acknowledged, taken years ago at a holiday gathering. Evelyn stood in the background, slightly out of focus, smiling politely as she held a serving tray, while Victor stood in the foreground, younger, unaware of how much she had anchored his life. He stared at the image longer than he intended to. Later that day, as Naomi organized the linen closet, Victor paused in the hallway, listening to the rhythm of her movements. It was the same rhythm Evelyn had kept, efficient but unhurried, as if she understood that rushing never truly saved time. Hey! Memory surfaced of Evelyn once asking for a day off to attend Naomi's graduation, a request he had approved without much thought, barely looking up from his desk. He had not asked how it went. He had not asked about Naomi. Now, standing there, he felt the discomfort of that omission. Naomi finished her task and turned, startled to see him there. She lowered her eyes respectfully, waiting for instruction. Victor studied her face, searching for something he could not yet name. There was a resemblance, not in features, but in presence, in the quiet steadiness that filled the space around her. For the first time, Victor felt the past pressing into the present, not as nostalgia, but as accountability. He said nothing and walked away, but the question had already taken root, and Naomi sensed it too, The subtle shift in the air that told her the truth she had carried alone was beginning to surface, whether she was ready for it or not. The moment that shifted everything arrived on an ordinary afternoon, disguised as inconvenience rather than crisis, the kind of moment most people would forget if it did not carry meaning. Victor Hale was preparing to leave for a late meeting when the house lost power without warning, the lights flickering once before fading into stillness. Outside, rain fell steadily, not dramatic, just persistent, tapping against the tall windows with a quiet insistence. Victor stood in the hallway, irritated, checking his phone for updates, already calculating delays. Before he could call anyone, Naomi moved past him without a word, retrieving a flashlight from a drawer beneath the staircase, the exact drawer Evelyn Carter had always used. She handed it to him briefly, then continued on, her steps confident, purposeful. Victor watched her pause at the breaker panel, counting silently, her lips moving as she waited before resetting it, a habit Evelyn had sworn prevented overload. The lights returned moments later, steady and calm. Victor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He followed Naomi into the kitchen, where she began preparing a light meal he had not requested but clearly needed, toast and soup, the same combination Evelyn used to insist on during long days. Victor started to protest, then stopped. His head felt heavier than usual, his vision slightly unfocused, something he had dismissed all day as fatigue. Naomi noticed immediately. She did not ask if he was unwell. She simply adjusted the chair, guided him to sit, and placed the bowl in front of him, waiting until he took the first sip before stepping back. The gesture was careful, respectful, practiced. Victor looked up at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, saw fear flicker briefly behind her calm. Not fear of him, but fear of failing at something important. He remembered another afternoon years ago when Evelyn had done the same thing, had insisted he sit, had monitored him quietly until color returned to his face. At the time, he had brushed it off, too busy to notice the concern behind her eyes. Now, seated at the same table, the memory pressed in with unexpected force. Naomi stood near the counter, hands folded, waiting to see if he would finish. When he did, she nodded once, relief softening her expression before she masked it again. The rain outside grew heavier, the sound filling the space between them. Victor broke the silence, his voice lower than usual. He asked where she had learned to anticipate his routines so precisely. Naomi hesitated, the answer resting on her tongue, but she chose silence, lowering her eyes again, retreating into the role that had kept her safe. Victor did not press her, but the question lingered, unanswered, heavy. That evening, after Naomi finished her tasks, she lingered briefly in the kitchen, her shoulders sagging once she was alone. She thought of her mother, of Evelyn's warnings to listen more than speak, to let actions carry truth. She wondered how long she could maintain the balance between what she knew and what Victor was beginning to suspect. Upstairs, Victor stood at his bedroom window, watching the rain streak down the glass. His body felt steadier, but his thoughts did not. The way Naomi had moved, the way she had known, it was no longer coincidence. It was inheritance. He realized then that he was standing at the edge of a truth that would demand more than acknowledgement. It would demand responsibility. And for the first time since Evelyn Carter had left his life, Victor Hale felt the weight of what it meant to be cared for by someone he had never truly seen. Victor Hale did not sleep well that night, his rest broken by fragments of memory he had long ignored, moments resurfacing with an insistence he could no longer dismiss. By morning, the decision had already formed, though he did not yet name it. He requested Naomi's presence in the study later that afternoon, the message delivered quietly, without explanation. When Naomi entered the room, the sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. She stood near the door, hands folded, her posture respectful but tense, as if she sensed that something had shifted beyond her control. Victor remained seated behind his desk, not in command, but in thought. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched, heavy but not hostile. Victor finally looked up, his gaze steady, searching her face for answers he already suspected. He asked her how long she had been planning this, how long she had intended to step into a role that had not belonged to her. Naomi drew in a slow breath. When she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, stripped of defensiveness. She said she had not planned anything. She said she had come because her mother could not. She explained that Evelyn Carter had never intended to be replaced, but circumstances had left a space that needed to be filled. Naomi told him she had not asked for special treatment, had not expected recognition. She had only promised her mother that the work would be done with the same care, the same respect, even if no one noticed. Victor listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. He asked then what had happened to Evelyn, why she had left so suddenly without explanation. Naomi's composure wavered just enough to reveal the cost of her restraint. She said her mother had grown ill quietly, choosing not to burden anyone who did not need to know. She said Evelyn believed her absence would be temporary, that rest would restore what years of service had taken. When it became clear that recovery would be slower, harder, Evelyn chose dignity over disclosure. She chose to step away rather than ask for accommodation. Victor felt the weight of that choice settle heavily in his chest. Naomi continued, explaining that the bills did not pause for illness, that the household depended on income as much as it depended on routine. She said she had stepped forward not out of obligation, but gratitude, because the job had given her mother stability for years. Victor leaned back slowly, his eyes drifting to the bookshelf, to the photograph he had turned upright days earlier. He realized then that he had benefited from Evelyn's loyalty without ever asking what it cost her. He asked Naomi why she had not told him sooner. Naomi met his gaze for the first time, her eyes steady, unafraid. She said her mother had taught her that respect did not demand explanation. She said she believed actions would speak louder than words, that the truth would surface when it needed to. The room fell quiet again, the kind of quiet that followed understanding rather than confusion. Victor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds he had built his life around. When he spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of authority, filled instead with something like regret. He acknowledged that he had overlooked the humanity of someone who had supported his life for decades. He acknowledged that Naomi had carried that humanity forward without asking for acknowledgement. He turned back to her then, his expression changed, not softened, but sharpened by clarity. He told her that her presence in the house was no longer invisible. He told her that what she had done could not be dismissed as coincidence or convenience. Naomi listened quietly, her shoulders squared, as if bracing for consequence rather than reward. In that moment, Victor Hale understood that the truth he had uncovered did not demand punishment or praise, but responsibility, and that the measure of his character would be defined by what he chose to do next. The days that followed were marked by a different kind of silence, one that carried intention rather than uncertainty. Victor Hale did not announce any changes, did not summon advisors, or issue sweeping declarations. Instead, he observed, recalibrating his habits with deliberate care. Naomi noticed first in the smallest ways. Her schedule shifted subtly, no longer stretched thin by unnecessary tasks. Supplies were restocked without her needing to request them. The staff kitchen, once an afterthought, was reorganized and maintained with the same attention given to the rest of the house. These were not gestures of charity, but signals of respect, and Naomi felt the difference immediately. One morning, Victor asked Naomi to sit with him in the dining room, not to serve, but to talk. The request alone altered the balance of the space. She took the chair across from him, hands folded, posture composed, ready to listen. Victor spoke without ceremony. He told her that Evelyn Carter's years of service would be formally acknowledged, that her departure would no longer exist as an unexplained gap in the household's history. He said arrangements had been made to ensure Evelyn's medical needs were covered, not as compensation, but as responsibility. Naomi absorbed the words slowly, her breath catching just enough to betray how much they mattered. She thanked him quietly, not with tears or relief, but with the steady gratitude of someone who had learned to expect little. Victor continued, explaining that Naomi's role in the house would change. She would no longer be temporary, no longer unseen. Her work would be defined clearly, fairly, with boundaries that respected her time and health. He asked her opinion on the structure, something no one had asked before. Naomi answered honestly, carefully, her voice gaining strength as she realized her perspective was being taken seriously. Outside the house, life continued as usual, buses running, shops opening, the world indifferent to the quiet recalibration happening within those walls. Naomi visited her mother that evening, carrying groceries and news she had not dared to hope for. Evelyn listened from her chair, her expression calm but proud, nodding as Naomi spoke. She did not celebrate loudly. She simply reached for her daughter's hand and held it, a silent acknowledgement that the weight Naomi had carried was finally shared. Back at the estate, Victor stood alone in the study, looking once more at the photograph on the shelf. This time, he did not turn it away. He understood now that leadership was not defined by distance or control, but by recognition. The house felt different, lighter, not because its structure had changed, but because its history had been honored. Naomi returned to work the next morning with the same quiet diligence, but something fundamental had shifted. She moved not as a replacement, but as herself, grounded in purpose rather than obligation. Victor noticed the change immediately. He greeted her by name, not out of formality, but acknowledgement. In that moment, the dynamic between them settled into something new, something balanced. The truth had not demanded spectacle or apology. It had demanded action, consistency, and the humility to correct what had been overlooked. And in choosing that path, Victor Hale found that the authority he wielded felt steadier, more legitimate, because it was finally aligned with the dignity of the people who had sustained his life without ever asking to be seen. The change became visible to others not through announcements, but through atmosphere. The subtle way a place carries intention when those inside it are treated with care. Staff members noticed that Naomi Carter was no longer rushed through tasks or spoken to only when necessary. They noticed Victor Hale's tone shift when he addressed her, calm and direct, no longer distant. The house functioned more smoothly, not because of new rules, but because its rhythms had finally aligned with the people who maintained them. One afternoon, Victor invited a small group of associates to the estate for a meeting that extended longer than planned. Naomi prepared refreshments quietly, placing everything with deliberate order, then stepped back as she always did. As the discussion wore on, Victor felt the familiar fatigue creep in, but this time, before it could become visible, Naomi adjusted the lighting, softened the glare from the windows, and placed water within reach. She did not interrupt. She did not announce herself. She simply acted, the way Evelyn once had, the way care often moved when it was genuine. One of the guests noticed and remarked on the efficiency of the household, an offhand compliment that might once have gone unacknowledged. Victor responded without hesitation, crediting Naomi directly, stating her name with clarity. The room felt briefly quiet, not awkward, but attentive. Naomi felt the weight of the moment, not as pressure, but as validation. That evening, after the guests departed, Victor stood in the entryway, watching Naomi prepare to leave for the night. He offered to have a car take her home, a practical consideration, not a favor. Naomi declined politely, explaining her routine, her preference for the bus that allowed her to stop by her mother's apartment. Victor accepted the answer without question, respecting the boundary. It was a small exchange, but it carried meaning. At home, Naomi shared dinner with Evelyn, the two sitting comfortably, the silence between them filled with understanding. Evelyn listened as Naomi spoke about her day, about the way the house felt different, about how Victor Hale had begun to see what had always been there. Evelyn smiled faintly, not surprised. She reminded Naomi that dignity did not come from recognition, but recognition mattered because it shaped how people were treated moving forward. The following week, Victor reviewed old records, quietly correcting omissions that had been made over years of oversight. He ensured that Evelyn Carter's contribution was documented, her departure acknowledged with respect. He arranged for her continued support without publicity, understanding that justice did not require an audience. Naomi noticed the changes without comment, her work continuing with the same steadiness, now grounded in security rather than necessity. One morning, as she arranged fresh flowers in the hallway, Victor paused beside her. He thanked her, not for the task at hand, but for what she had shown him about accountability. Naomi met his gaze briefly, nodding once. There was no speech, no reconciliation scene, only mutual recognition. The house settled into its new equilibrium, one where the past was neither erased nor romanticized, but honored through action. Naomi moved forward knowing her mother's sacrifices had not been forgotten. Victor moved forward aware that power carried responsibility beyond transactions and outcomes. In that shared understanding, The quiet justice of the situation revealed itself not through triumph, but through the steady restoration of balance, the kind that endured because it was built on respect rather than spectacle. The final shift did not arrive with ceremony, but with a morning that felt lighter than those before it, as though the house itself had exhaled. Naomi Carter arrived as usual before sunrise, the city still half asleep, and moved through the estate with the same care she always had. Yet there was a difference now, not in her steps, but in her posture. She no longer moved as if she needed to justify her presence. She moved as someone who belonged. Victor Hale noticed it immediately, the way she carried herself with calm certainty, no longer bracing for dismissal or misunderstanding. He watched from a distance as she completed her work, aware that something essential had settled between them. Later that day, Victor prepared to leave town for several weeks, a rare absence that once would have unsettled him. This time, he felt no such unease. He reviewed his schedule, left clear instructions, and trusted that the house would function without his constant oversight. Before departing, he asked Naomi to step into the study one last time. There was no tension in the room, no unresolved question hanging between them. He thanked her again, simply and directly, and told her that Evelyn Carter's name would remain part of the household's history, not as a footnote, but as a foundation. Naomi listened quietly, absorbing the words without outward reaction. When she responded, she spoke of her mother not with sadness, but with pride. She said Evelyn had always believed that how you leave a place matters as much as how you enter it. Victor nodded, understanding the truth in that statement more deeply than before. After he left, the house carried on, steady and balanced. Naomi continued her work, now mentoring another young staff member with the same patience her mother had once shown her. She corrected gently, explained routines carefully, passing on knowledge not as authority, but as stewardship. In the evenings, she returned home to Evelyn, their small apartment, filled with quiet conversation and shared meals. The fear that had once shadowed their days slowly faded, replaced by stability earned through perseverance rather than luck. Weeks later, Victor returned to find the estate unchanged in function but transformed in spirit. The staff moved with confidence, the routines held, and the house felt anchored. He walked through the halls and paused by the photograph on the shelf, studying it one last time. Evelyn Carter's smile seemed to carry new meaning now, not as a reminder of what had been lost, but of what had been restored. Victor understood then that power was not diminished by acknowledgement. It was refined by it. Naomi crossed the hallway as he stood there, offering a respectful nod before continuing on her way. There was no need for words. The truth had already done its work. And in that quiet understanding, the legacy of sacrifice, once unseen, had finally been honored, not through grand gestures, but through daily respect. That day, without an audience or applause, the world within those walls remembered what dignity looks like.